I'm here today to bring you a bit of inspiration from the original writings of Paramhansa Yogananda. And today we're doing this at 12 o'clock on weekdays. Today I have one quote I would like to discuss. It's very brief. And the second quote I'll also read, which I'll be discussing on Friday. Today's quote is, "You cannot love God and at the same time be unkind to your associates. You can't love him and be full of wrath. How you behave towards others both reflects your inner consciousness and conditions it." And the second quote, I'll just go ahead and read it right now. They're very similar, but also very different on some key points. "Never imagine that you can win God's love if you can't win the love of your fellow creatures. As you love him, so should you love him in all." So the subtle difference of this first quote is that he's talking specifically about negative behavior. We cannot be unkind to those we associate with. We can't love him and be full of wrath. The extreme example of this that comes to mind is the sort of, fist pounding, hellfire and brimstone preachers of, I want to say of the past, but it's of the past. It's of the past age, but it's unfortunately still around in today's societies. And that, speaking of love with anger, speaking of God with anger, any of this, it's really not the words that we say. It is the intention. It is what is in our hearts that is important and that ultimately matters and conveys what it is we're trying to say. I came of age in the late 60s as a young adult, and that was a very tumultuous time in America. It was the time of assassinations of John F. Kennedy, of his brother Robert Kennedy, of Martin Luther King. And it was just a lot of turmoil with the Vietnam War and anti-war demonstrations and on and on. And some of that, for instance, Martin Luther King went through great self-discipline to learn the ways of not cooperating with evil in two ways. By one, not cooperating with it, and second, replacing that resistance or adding to that resistance a genuine, heartfelt love in his heart for a non-judgment of those who were persecuting him in so many ways, of anyone really, recognizing the divinity. He was he was a yogi really in so many ways, by being able to recognize the divine in everyone and resisting and not fighting and becoming unkind and angry with those who were persecuting him or just simply abiding by laws that had no business being laws, and changing things ultimately through the courts, but mostly through his own example. Similarly with Gandhi, who, was assassinated, I think it was in 1947, so that was just before I was born. But nevertheless, he, got the British to leave India, was able to lead millions of people in a nonviolent manner to bring about change and peace. And there are other ways that, involve revolution, that involve fighting, and in some cases that may be necessary. Yogananda used to occasionally scold his disciples. He never liked having to do so, but he knew he had to do it, just like a surgeon has to cut out the sick part of our human bodies so that we can heal and be better again. And so he did it, but he never did it with anger in his heart. He always did it out of love and compassion, and he could exercise just the right amount of sternness so that we got the point. And Swami Kriyananda learned this from him. And trust me, he was able to do that also in a similar manner. And so you knew that he meant it. You needed to change. He was incredibly strong and forthright about it. And yet the love in his heart and the love in his eyes were constant, and they were calm. And so learning to not live in wrath, to not live with unkindness, because they are inimical to the spiritual life, to our own higher natures. And so practicing transcending those in a wholesome ways. And at least if we're starting to feel anger or wrathful, you know how they say when you get emotional, step back, count to 10 before you say anything. Whatever it takes, start working on those practices that can help us transition from expressing negative emotions to expressing God's love and God's will in all the steps that we try to take in our lives. So joy to you, and I'll see you again on Friday, but my husband Riemann will see you tomorrow at 12 o'clock.